So my name is Sue Bolton. I'm a member of Socialist Alliance and I'm also a Moreland councillor. There might be a few people might come in a little bit later, but we'll make room for everybody. So I'd like to really welcome especially our panel, including Ronan, who is overseas in Britain, joining us from Britain via Zoom, as well as our local speakers. I'll introduce them in a moment, but we do have a really fantastic and interesting panel. Now, the first part of the meeting will be live streamed. The section of the meeting where we have the panel of speakers speaking, but unfortunately we're not able to live stream the discussion, so it'll just be the speakers that will live stream. I would like to recognise first that we're standing on Aboriginal land that was stolen and never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung. So just to introduce our speakers, so the order of speakers will be Ronan Lee will speak first, followed by, well, actually I'll do a little very brief description for each speaker as I mentioned who's speaking. And then maybe the speakers might want to say a little bit more about themselves. They don't have to, but if they'd like to, they're welcome. So our first speaker will be Ronan Lee, who's from the International State Crime Initiative, was formerly an academic at Deakin Uni in Victoria, and he's the author of a book called Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History and Hate Speech. So he'll be the first speaker. Then our next speaker will be Jed Din. Jed is part of a member of the Victorian Myanmar Youth, and the Victorian Myanmar Youth, the VMY, are the main organisers of all of the solidarity actions happening in Victoria at the moment. And so they've been organising weekly protests and events, which has been and meeting really pretty much every night. They've been, working really hard to provide solidarity to everyone in Myanmar who's fighting and struggling, protesting on the streets. Jed will be followed by Alan Jennings, who is a Green Left Weekly journalist, and he's written some of the copy in Green Left Weekly, our newspaper. In fact, I might get someone to bring me a copy so I can display it. And he's also a member of Socialist Alliance. Alan lived in Myanmar for a few years. So this is our newspaper, and it's got an article on the back about Adani's links with the Myanmar military. And our final speaker will be Habib, who's from the Australian spokesperson for the Burma Rohingya Organisation, and as well as being very involved in the Rohingya community, Habib has also been a refugee activist as well, having to combat the horrible racist and inhumane practices of the Australian government. So I'd like to welcome all the speakers. It'll be a fantastic panel. Now, because we've got 4 speakers, they won't have a long time to speak, so they'll each speak for approximately 12 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for questions and comments, and there'll be other people who might have comments they'd like to make in discussion as well as asking questions. And then the speakers will be able to respond to questions and comments during the discussion and make final wrap-up comments. So, there'll be plenty of time for everyone to make their points or ask questions or whatever. So, I'd like to start with Ronan. Thanks very much, Ronan.
Brilliant. And are you guys seeing
thanks,
images, or is it just
let me just
audio?
confirm that you can in fact hear me.
We can hear you loud.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, I'll make sure I look.
We'll be able to see it.
All right. Well, I'll move the camera back a little bit so that I maybe not quite as not quite as in it. Well, look, thanks so much for organising this. It's good to join you. I want to just obviously mention that this is not the first event that Sue and her team have organised on this subject. One of the immense frustrations for people who've worked on subjects like the situation in Myanmar is that there are people who do great work, but whenever there's international media attention or even national media attention, you get all sorts of other people who come out of the woodwork and I think sometimes distract from important narratives and important messages. And so I'm always delighted to participate in events that are organised by groups that have actually got a long-standing history and understanding of the issues, and great to be on another panel with Habib as well. So hi Habib. I should start by mentioning that, well, I'll admit, I was surprised that a coup took place on the 1st of February. It was not something that was beyond the realm of possibility, and it was the prospect of a coup was something that, in fact, I'd mentioned in my book as a potential. But my feeling by the time we got to the 1st of Feb was that the military had come to terms with the situation as it existed in Myanmar. And the situation was this, that they had a constitution that they wrote in 2008 that gave them immense political and economic power. 25% of the seats in the parliament were occupied by soldiers wearing uniforms, appointed directly by the commander-in-chief of the military, Min Aung Hlaing, who was subject to zero civilian oversight of military decisions. So here's a situation where the military is, in fact, constitutionally a law unto itself. There was no oversight. The other elected representatives in the country had no means of exercising any oversight or scrutiny on the activities of the military. I mean, a perilous situation that you could imagine, even with the military whose history had until recently, if a military's history had been positive and you gave them that sort of free hand, you'd be deeply concerned about what would immediately occur. This was a military that has a history of brutal repression of the people of Myanmar, and they're granted 25% of the seats in the parliament. They're granted ministerial positions that are reserved for them in important roles, and they've got zero oversight and zero scrutiny from the elected civilian politicians. It was a pretty concerning situation for the civilians in Myanmar, and I thought, and I think most people thought, pretty good deal from the military's point of view. There was an election held last November, and again, overwhelmingly rejected the military's proxy candidates. I mean, they came home with 8% of the available seats. So of the remaining 75, a proxy party comes home with about 8% of the available seats. And that was less than they got at the 2015 election. So we're seeing that at every opportunity, the people are rejecting the military as best they can. That seems to have upset the military to a degree that I think has surprised a lot of us. It seemed to be the point where they realized that they were never going to have any more power within Myanmar than they had had in the past, and that the country was genuinely rejecting them at every opportunity. They were upset at the conduct of the election, they said, and they followed a playbook that had been laid out, in fact, by Trump. They claimed that an election undertaken during COVID times was rife with electoral fraud. They claimed that it didn't reflect the will of the people, and they blamed the elected the representatives of the majority that were elected, and that's Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, and we can talk a bit more about her later. I don't want you to think for a moment that I think she's a positive representative of the people. She's a racist, but she and her party did represent the majority of those elected at the election in November. The military blamed her. She, though, was not minded to negotiate with them in the lead up to the members of parliament taking up their seats in early February. So there's a difference between Myanmar and Australia. They have elections in November, and the system is very much that the parliamentarians aren't regarded as parliamentarians until they've officially taken up their seats. It would be constitutionally probably a little bit similar to Australia. There's often a lag between the election and when the parliament first sits, but in Myanmar it's a clearly determined lag. So the new government doesn't come in. It wouldn't be expected to have come in till the parliament had sat. So for instance, in 2015, there was an election in November, but the new government didn't take up its seats till I think end of the following March or the beginning of of April of 2016. During that period, there was a crisis. This time, so between November 20 and February, Tzu Chi didn't negotiate to the military's satisfaction. There was some intervention, I understand, from Chinese diplomats in the week leading up to the coup in an attempt to forestall any potential coup. The military started to talk about a coup during that week, but the overwhelming feeling of most observers at the end of January was the military had a pretty good deal. They'd done as much saber rattling as they were likely to do, and ultimately they would not want to upset the apple cart too much. We were wrong about that, and we were wrong for a number of reasons. The obvious one is that we became comfortable with with where Myanmar was at, and we didn't realise that the military hadn't changed one iota in terms of international observers. The military hasn't changed. This is the same military that genocidally attacked the Rohingya in 2017. This is the same military that's been in constant conflict with ethnic minorities in Myanmar since the 1950s. They're brutal. They're horrid. They're guilty of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are not my assessment. This is UN investigators assessing this. And they wanted absolute power within Myanmar, and they weren't going to get that with an elected parliament that wasn't prepared to give in to them, which is what they realised they had with the outcome of November's election. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the potential for Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general who launched the coup. It was due to retire this year. It was at the mandatory age, and it was clear that the new parliament would not pass legislation to allow him to extend his stay. And of course, he and his family have extensive business interests within Myanmar. They would be at risk were he forced to retire, and that the perception was that was another key motivator for him in particular as the head of the military, pushing for a coup and ultimately launching a coup. What do the coup involve? Arresting the elected politicians. They've been incommunicado. They've been charged. Some have been charged with COVID-related offences going back to the election campaign and other things. But the nature of the charges are irrelevant because it's a military that will just. It uses the law arbitrarily. So we can sort of look beyond what someone might be charged with. Others will be charged with security offences and various things like that. But they'll simply keep those politicians in jail. They're not going to let them out because they don't want to provide a rallying point for the community. But the community has rallied, and the community's rallied in a couple of important ways. Obviously, there's those who support and are connected with the elected politicians. So the old sort of National League for Democracy folk who want a return to Aung San Suu Kyi of the civilian rule of Aung San Suu Kyi. But I think most importantly, there's a very strong civil disobedience movement in Myanmar now. There's a general strike underway. And that has pushed the demands of the protest movement beyond simply a return to the pre-coup status quo. And I think that's, for me, one of the most important things that's come out of this. Myanmar's a really young country. 70% of the country weren't born in 1988. So that's when Aung San Suu Kyi first came to political prominence during an uprising. Then 70% of the country weren't born when that occurred, and they've many of them have grown up with access to the outside world. They've grown up with they've grown up with access to the internet that their parents didn't have. They're far more internationalist. They're far more globalist. They've linked with the Milk Tea Alliance, and they've got aspirations for themselves that are simply not a return to the status quo that the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi's government had given them. They don't want to return. They don't simply want the old 2008 constitution put back in place and the military to maintain their privileges. They want the military fully out of politics, and they've actively pursued strategies of unity with other groups in a way that activists from the majority group, the Burma in Myanmar, it's a Buddhist group, has in the past really not done to this extent. People have legitimately argued in the past that the dispute between the military and Aung San Suu Kyi was in fact a dispute between two elite groups within the majority ethnicity. These protests are not that. These protests are the people showing remarkable unity nationally, opposing a brutal military regime. Important, and Habib will no doubt talk about this, but there has been a reaching out to Rohingya as part of that protest movement in a way that we wouldn't have expected even 1 year ago or 6 months ago. There's now an understanding from many among the majority of the country. Now, not everyone. I mean, this is far from wholesale change, but there is an acknowledgement by many that many of the crimes that they heard had been undertaken against the Rohingya, but frankly didn't believe because they considered them too brutal, that they thought people were play acting. They're now realizing that those things are happening on their street. They're happening in Mandalay and Yangon and Bago. So there's a reckoning going on for many in Myanmar with what has happened with the Rohingya and their silence on that there's an understanding that maybe the aspirations of the ethnic minority groups, basic things, they want some local autonomy, which is not unreasonable. They want their culture and language to be valued, which is not unreasonable. But there's an understanding now that those things are not markers of sedition as they were often presented by the military in the past, but they're just reasonable demands, and they've been seen as reasonable demands by many people in Myanmar who a year ago would have ignored them or rejected them. So that's an important change that's underway. That unity, I think, is incredibly important. Where are we now, I think, is important too. Well, where we are is chaos. We've had this is week 11. The military launched the coup on the 1st of Feb. They would have expected, using their usual tactics. I mean, the military in Myanmar's usual tactics are shooting people or brutalizing people in other ways as a means of getting them to do what the military wants to do. That hasn't worked this time, and we're 11 weeks in. And what we've got is a general strike, a massive civil disobedience movement. The banks are barely functioning. When an ATM opens, there are mile-long queues to access cash, literally mile-long queues.
2 minutes to go, Ronan.
Yep, no worries. I'll finish with this. Literally mile-long queues. So the banking system is tottering. It's about to collapse. The public service isn't working. The public transport is literally at a standstill. This is a country that is simply not working, and the military are in a position now where the people have made clear that they simply won't work for them. So where that leaves the international community is that they've got the military who the people won't work for. The country can't function if the military is in control. But the military believes that they need to convince the people, and the way they intend to do that is by shooting them. And we saw that in Bago on the weekend. where they used rifle-propelled grenades against peaceful protesters, piling bodies up in pagodas, burning people alive, as instances of that as well. There are now 756 people dead, 50 children shot in their homes. This is a brutal military, and it's not going to stop its brutality until someone stops them. The people won't work for them, and that means that Myanmar is heading very quickly towards either a situation where there is a widespread civil war, or it becomes a failed state, and that's a problem for the region and the world. From the West's point of view, Western rhetoric has been great. It's been much better than it's been under Trump when it comes to Myanmar, but that's all it's been. There's been not much more. We need a global arms embargo at a minimum. There's no excuse for people being able to. There's no excuse for the military being able to buy more bullets because they're using them against children. So at a minimum, we need a global arms embargo. We probably need the international community. In fact, we do need the international community now to recognise the alternate government, which would likely have to be the representatives of the elected politicians plus others. So the CRPH, the representatives, the elected politicians, and I'd say CRPH plus. So those reps plus ethnic minorities and others need to be included in that process, and that needs to happen immediately. And we need to see UN investigators and probably Guterres on the ground in Myanmar. They need to go there. I mean, enough of the excuses. We don't need another nice statement from Guterres. We don't need anything more from Biden. We need them to go there. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks heaps, Ronan. That was really great. Now it's my privilege to introduce Jed Din, who's been super active in the movement here.